Thank you for coming to the 3:45 panel, and we will try to do our best to keep it exciting, keep everyone on their toes after lunch. So the title of this panel is Do Prisons Rehabilitate? And the discussion today will focus on, in 2018, what we think of that question. In 1974, criminologist Robert Martinson he authored a report entitled The Effectiveness of Correctional Treatment, a Survey of Treatment Evaluation Studies. In that report, he wrote, "Nothing works." Quote, "The represent array of correctional treatments has no appreciable effect, positive or negative, on rates of recidivism of convicted offenders." In August of 1975, Robert Martinson appeared on 60 Minutes in a segment entitled It Doesn't Work. Journalist Mike Wallace said that Martinson's findings are sending shockwaves through the correctional establishment. He described parole as almost a Machiavellian attempt by offenders to get out. Psychological counseling may be, quote, "a good way to pass the time, but otherwise it has no effect." 4 decades later, volumes of research indicate the benefit and the potential of certain evidence-based programs to reduce recidivism, improve public safety. The federal government's funding and support of the Justice Reinvestment Grant, the Second Chance Grant, have certainly supported programming in prisons, reentry efforts, community partnerships, and investments in rehabilitation in the criminal justice correctional world. Yet, America's prisons have a recidivism rate, and for all of you who are in the room, you all probably know this, but the rate at which someone who leaves prison and returns within 3 years, depending on which recidivism rate you're using, of nearly 40%. Nationally, about 76% of incarcerated people will end up back in prison within 5 years. Former Attorney General Eric Holder stated, "We need to ensure that incarceration is used to punish, deter, and rehabilitate, not merely to convict, warehouse, and forget." Have we forgotten those who are warehoused behind bars in this country? Today, we will discuss efforts our panelists are taking to ensure that prisons don't simply warehouse and forget about the, if we include jails, 2.2 million people behind bars in this country. We will explore whether prisons do rehabilitate in 2018. Today, we have with us Anthony Annucci, Acting Commissioner of the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision. Commissioner Annucci joined the department in 1984 as Deputy Counsel and was promoted to Deputy Commissioner and Counsel in 1989. In his over 30 years at the New York State Department of Corrections and Community Supervision, he has drafted legislation and He has drafted legislation that has been signed into law by 5 different governors. He has long been a leader in sentencing reform and correctional program legislation in New York, and we are thrilled to have him here today. Immediately to his right is Rachel Sievers, who is currently at the Disability Rights Washington as a staff attorney. And she focuses on ensuring that disability-related issues in corrections she litigates and really focuses on changing policies for those behind bars, specifically for those who have disabilities. And she is here today to talk about her work to change those policies, and she has some pretty shocking statistics about individuals with disabilities behind bars to share with us today. Immediately to her right is Amy Lopez. Amy Lopez is currently at the DC Department of Corrections in Washington, DC. She's the deputy director there. Before that, she served as superintendent of education for the Texas Juvenile Justice Department and was later recruited to initiate education reforms for the 160,000 incarcerated people in custody at the Texas Department of Criminal Justice by the Windham School District. In 2016, former Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates recruited Ms. Lopez to build a school district within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. And so she is here today to tell us, to talk to us about expanding college and career readiness programs and educational opportunities for those behind bars, specifically in Washington, D.C. Immediately to Rachel's right is Bianca Tylick, who is the director of the Corrections Accountability Project at the Urban Justice Center. In this role, she combines her expertise in both criminal justice and financial services to combat the commercial exploitation of the criminal justice system. Bianca also worked as an Equal Justice Works Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law, and has experience working with the New York City Department of Corrections, the Massachusetts Department of Corrections, and the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections. Before attending law school, she also worked in financial services. So I'm thrilled to have this extraordinary panel with us today. And Commissioner Annucci, I'd like to start with you. Can you talk about the educational and vocational programs that currently exist in New York prisons? And can you speak about the work that you've done to spearhead increased college opportunities in prisons in New York State?
Education is the purest form of rehabilitation. There's all types of programs we provide, but of all of them, I think education in all of its forms, and we have vocational education programs, we have higher education programs with our relationships, we have remedial education. All the different types of education that are made available are the purest form of rehabilitation. And they're not just a means to help someone get a job when they get out. There's so much more. They are the pathway for someone to discover their own humanity. And when they discover their own humanity, they're capable of understanding and appreciating the humanity in others. You've often heard about thinking for a change, those types of programs. Those are the state of the art, how we want to reach the population. Education is the highest form of thinking for a change. And right now, we are at a very interesting point in our history as a country. I think it was a terrible mistake when we got rid of Pell Grants and then TAP grants in this state, because higher education belongs in a correctional facility setting. All of us are familiar with that commercial we've seen many times on television. One of the most successful campaigns to raise money for higher education. You see a scene where a young man with an envelope excitingly running to his parents saying, "Mom, Dad, I got into the college of my choice." And the parents, looking somber, say, "I'm sorry, son, we don't just have the money to pay for college." And then you hear a voiceover saying, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." And that very simple but profound statement is true wherever that mind is. And if it's behind the walls of a correctional facility, a mind is a terrible thing to waste. So at this point in time in history, we have a lot of robust relationships with a lot of different college consortiums. There are about over 1,300 individuals right now taking college courses, and then there are correspondence courses. They're at 27 different correctional facilities. We want to expand that. But one of the things I've done, I got a letter in the fall of 2013 signed by two women who are producers, and they want to do a documentary about college and prison, specifically the BART initiative, BPI, which is one of a number of different relationships we have. And they want to come in with their television cameras and film all kinds of things, which is a little bit of a dicey proposition when you're considering that. But this is under the auspices of Ken Burns, and we all know what kind of work he has done with producing documentaries on Vietnam, the Civil War, jazz, whatever it is, he tells a compelling story, and it's captivating for the audience. So with the approval of my principals, we started down that road. They've been filming for over 5 years. We are now at that point where they have just said, these are the final credits, what are your suggestions on who we thank, et cetera. And this is hopefully for release in early 2019. And I think it is going to resonate with the entire country, because when you see up close and personal individuals, you couldn't have a more divergent optical picture. The image of someone when they're first arrested for a crime, maybe a violent crime, they look disheveled, they look angry. And at the other end of the spectrum, what they look like in a cap and gown, going up to receive a degree from the president of the university, clapping and cheering from their fellow students, and parents and other family members in the audience with tears. The incredible dichotomy is just eye-opening. And I think when this documentary airs, it is really going to open up eyes and minds in this country to the importance of higher education, not just for lowering recidivism, but for keeping safer prisons, and the multiplier effect, what it does for someone to say, now my son can look up to me, now he wants to go to college. Now my brother wants to go to college. It's just transformative in the impact it has on individuals. And every time I turn around, there's something new. We're going to be hosting, or Connecticut will host, the New York Conference on Higher Education this coming weekend. I can't attend, but they are going to start off coming to Bedford Hills, where they're going to interface with the female students, and they're going to hear their presentations. And one of the things, among many, that I want everybody to take away is that in no way are the educational programs that are delivered behind the walls in any way watered down. They are at least as tough as the courses that are presented on campuses, and the students do just as well. In fact, at so many graduations that I attend, I hear the faculty repeatedly say that these students behind the walls are more serious, more engaged, work harder, are more appreciative of what's delivered to them than many times the students on campus, where you have all the social distractions and possibly drinking, whatever. These students are very serious, they're appreciative, and they don't have all of the other amenities that you get on college campuses and personal computers and access to the internet. So that when they get a degree, they truly earn a degree. So at this point in time in the history of our country, where people are talking about mass incarceration, yes, I get the anger by private citizens who said, okay, I can't send my kid to college, but if you commit a crime and you go to state prison, you get a free degree. This country needs to have a separate discussion about that. College should be available to almost everybody that wants it, but that should be a separate discussion. You can't conflate the two about educational opportunities behind the walls, because if you did that kind of logic, then you would extend it to things like, well, there are people that have never committed a crime who go to bed hungry every night. There are people who have never committed a crime who are homeless. So therefore, why should we provide that to someone who's behind the walls? You can't conflate those two things. But education, to me, is the purest form of rehabilitation, and I'm very optimistic where we are going, especially when you hold up the individuals that have gotten degrees. You listen to them speak at graduations. They talk from the bottom of their heart where they came from. And don't forget this, many of these individuals did not have easy lives. Many of them were victims themselves. They had really tough upbringing. I just got an email today. We're having a graduation, NYU at Wallkill, and the speaker that they've chosen is Michelle Jones, who transferred to this state from Indiana. Horrific background, crime-wise. Got pregnant at 14. Her mother tried to induce an abortion, hitting her with a wooden stake, and how she was transformed, how accomplished she's become. And she will be the speaker at the graduation for NYU at Wallkill, which I always try to go to. I try to be at as many graduations as I can to show my personal support and give a message to the population. The other thing is, don't ever underestimate the classroom experience itself, right? Because you bring people together to learn in the same common environment, and what happens is you have people suddenly who may not otherwise affiliate with each other learn that perhaps they have more in common than they have differences, and the tremendous camaraderie that comes about that you see at graduation, everyone supporting one another at these graduations. And one last example to show how out of the box we are in this state and how we think of things. And, you know, we have the Pell Grant funding, we have Danny, the District Attorney of New York. As a pilot, I think it was a year ago, we started a criminal justice course. We selected 8 students from Queensborough Correctional Facility. We brought in 8 outside students. The outside students were assistant district attorneys, prosecutors. Think for a moment about this. The last time you had representatives from these 2 cohorts in the same physical setting was the courtroom. The DA trying to get a conviction, the defendant trying to avoid conviction, trying to avoid as much as possible state prison time or to shorten the sentence. Now they're together in the same physical setting studying a criminal justice course, and it gets better. They had to work together, groups of 4, on the same projects. And you had to be there for the graduation to hear the speeches, one from the DA, how as a speaker, this changed her life, changed how she's going to relate to defendants in the courtroom, and of course from the students who said, you know, if we're part of the problem, then we also have to be part of the solution. And getting us involved in thinking about criminal justice solutions is one way to make a better criminal justice system. So the possibilities are endless in terms of educational opportunities, making them available behind the walls, and hopefully other systems will see this and the general public will accept it and understand that is a wise investment on many different levels. So thank you.
So Deputy Director Lopez, you also are overseeing a pretty innovative educational experience for the incarcerated people at the DC jail right now. And it's interesting because Commissioner Annucci spoke about, you know, I think New York is the beneficiary of the Barred Prison Project and some of the Obama-era pilot Pell Grants that the Obama administration tried to bring back, that the 1994 crime bill eliminated and did away with. But that's not how you've been able to innovate around educational opportunities. So it'd be great to hear what you're doing and how that really came to be.
I'm going to remind you we're a jail. So I'm going to list a lot of things that we've done over the last 12 months. And if you work in prisons, you're like, yeah, whatever. But I just want to remind you we're a jail. So, so when I took over 12 months ago, I think it's 14 now, but we had a GED prep program. There were maybe 15 students in it, and there were a couple of programs with Howard University. It was an inside-out program, and then UDC, University of District of Columbia, did a couple of certification programs, classes, and then that was it. So our vision when I was recruited to go to the DC DOC is how could we do all those things that you're talking about and give those opportunities. So I'm going to take a big breath. This is what we've done in the last year. So I'll end up with post-secondary since that one's kind of cool, and you alluded to that. We put in a literacy program because before I came there really wasn't a concerted effort to take non-readers to emerging readers to take them up to GED prep. Then of course we have GED prep, we have ESL. We work with the PD Green program to come in and do tutoring to help us with that classroom time. There was no vocational training, or in the education world we call it career and technical education now, CTE. There wasn't any of that. When I came on board, I came from Texas, and the first thing I did when I got to DC is I called our state education agency, right, and said, hey, where's my Carl Perkins money? And they said, oh, the DOC never applies for that money. So I was like, well, Give me that application. So we did, and with that money, we also did a lot of research on what are the jobs available in the DMV area, the D.C., Maryland, Virginia area, and what's viable. And so we looked at middle skill jobs. I know you all are familiar with that, at least a high school credential, less than a 4-year degree, because that's where most of our students fall. And then if you've been to D.C. lately, you'll know that construction is huge in D.C. right now. So we looked at construction jobs, and what are some kind of STEM jobs that could be middle school STEM jobs. And so then we created our career and technical education based on that. So we offer copper-based network cabling, a grounding and bonding course on a copper-based system. 98% of all buildings are copper-based, trying to move to fiber optic. So then we also offer fiber optic network cabling, telecommunications, an AV installation technician certification. These are all industry certs. UDC offers hospitality and tourism, things that would be viable jobs when our folks leave us. And then I also noticed that we had a lot of writers and creatives, and so we started a newspaper. So we have a journalism class. And just anecdotally, I put it out to all of our residents to name the newspapers. They've never had a newspaper. And they came out with the inside scoop, which I thought was so clever, right? I thought that was really neat. And then we had a local print shop that called me and said, hey, I hear through the grapevine you're trying to do a newspaper. I'm a returning citizen. And so to pay back, how about we just pay for the whole newspaper printing? How's that? And I went, oh, okay, yeah, we could do that. Yeah, we'll let you pay. So now we have a newspaper. We have commercial cleaning. So digital literacy. So all of these things that try to help somebody get a job. There was really no cognitive intervention. Of course, you mentioned thinking for a change. So we partnered with the NIC, but with a little twist, I hired a returning citizen to oversee all of our cognitive intervention programming and send him to training. And so who better to teach somebody how to change criminogenic thinking and transition home successfully than somebody who's done it. And D.C.'s a small town, so he grew up on the streets of D.C., and he's about my age, so like 30-something. That was a joke. Trying to liven it up. It's 3:45. So he's been around a while, right? And they all know him, and so he has the trust of our students, and so he leads the cognitive intervention program. And we also instituted something called master classes, and these are designed for folks that are, say, 60 to 90 days. They're about to be released, and so we try to get them those last-minute job skills, right? Do you have your resume ready and all of that stuff? But one of the things that Paul did, our returning citizen team member, is that he goes out and he makes all these connections with our local industries. And the first one we did, we brought those folks in and we did mock interviews, right, where you teach people interviewing skills, and then we let them have a shot and kind of made it seem like it was a real interview. And then the industry partners said, well, we have some job openings. Would anybody be interested in interviewing for real? And so when they got done, all but 3 people had a job waiting on them when they got out. And those 3 had a second interview when they got home and got a job. And so we plan to expand that. So those are some of the ways that we cycle through that. For post-secondary, that's probably been one of the most exciting expansions for us. First of all, I did take advantage of the Second Chance Pell Grant, but we did it through Ashland University, which is actually in Ohio, and they offer the courses through distance learning. So I also have connections with a New York-based company called American Prison Data Systems, and they manufacture a secure tablet. So it pings off of a cell tower, it doesn't go through the internet. So our students take these 4-credit college courses that lead to an associate's or bachelor's degree on an Android tablet. So they have the tablet with them at all times, and they take their courses, and we provide tutoring and study groups and all of that you would do, but they take that on the tablet. And we're really excited if I should knock on wood, as long as he is with us and can make it, we'll have our first graduate at the end of this semester. So he had some transfer credits, transferred them in, they accepted them. And so we have, from the first semester to now, we've quadrupled the number of students enrolled. And of course, they have to actually qualify. Thanks. they have to actually qualify for the second chance Pell. Thank you. And then we still have the Howard University program, but we actually recently hired Dr. Bahia Muhammad, and she works for Howard she's their Inside Out coordinator, and she's just brilliant. And so we actually hired her as a fellow, and so she's on our staff now. And so we have Howard Inside Out programs that also work with their law students, their chaplaincy students. So we have 79 this semester, 79 Howard students that take their courses inside with our students, with about the same number of DOC students. So they sit through those classes together. And we're actually working with Howard to work on some of those being for credit, even for our students. They're always for credit for their students. And then we have UDC that does some certification. But one of the most exciting partnerships was with Georgetown University, which is a little local university. And we did, for a couple of semesters, we did some not-for-credit classes that were fun. And they were around liberal arts and social justice kinds of topics. And we kind of got our feet wet with those 2 semesters. And then this semester we started the Georgetown Prison Scholars Program. And these are 4-credit courses where our students earn a bachelor's degree from Georgetown. And it's been really exciting. So we have about 20 students in that cohort, and Georgetown actually raised the money for their tuition. So it's tuition free for our students. And if they leave us, because remember we're in jail, so if they leave us before they finish this bachelor's degree, as long as they've maintained a 3.0, then when they come home, they have automatic admittance into this program in Georgetown and can finish there. Georgetown also created a program called the Pivot Program that helps with that reentry. So if they come back and come to Georgetown, they also help them get a job and housing, and so they take those guys in, and men and women, because our college classes are actually co-ed too, which is unusual. So we're really excited about that program, so we just launched that. So we've been able to do all of that in 12 months. A lot of that we did in the first 4 months. And I'm just going to add, we did it at no additional cost to the district or to the DOC. So we were able to find those monies at other places, and those are sustainable monies as well. So we went from 0 to I can't keep up, sort of. So, and our staff have having a hard time keeping up too, just trying to figure out who to escort where, because before they had like 15 GED students, right, and that was it. So I think coming from a system where I saw that the education programs that were, there, and I was innovative, but I wasn't building from scratch. To build something from scratch, I will tell you that the best thing is when we have a graduation, or we have families come in, or I have moms of 50-year-old students that are emailing me saying, oh my goodness, what are his grades, right? And I can't believe he's in college. And we had a federal judge that came through on a tour recently, and one of our students was on his tablet, and he said, this is a dream. It's not even a dream. I didn't even dream I would ever go to college. So I think that besides the numbers and the fact, that you're doing this logistical work every day, seeing that you're changing lives is beyond measure.
Thank you for that. And we just heard about how New York State and Washington, D.C. are trying to educate those who are behind bars and make use of Pell Grants and university funds to increase programming and hopefully reduce recidivism for those who are behind bars. But I'd like to ask Rachel, who really works to change policies for those behind bars who suffer disabilities and really sort of challenge this assumption about rehabilitation. We just heard about some wonderful programming. But from your perspective, and you work with a very specific population, can you talk about what the challenges are for individuals with disabilities who are incarcerated, who are in jails, and if you could also let everyone who's here listening know what some of those statistics are, because I know I for one just wasn't aware of how many people behind bars do suffer disabilities.
So I work in Washington State. My primary focus is working with people with disabilities in the prison system, the state prison system. We also cover jails, but I focus on the prisons. And about 30% of the prison population, the state prison population nationwide, has a disability. It's 40% in the jails, so that's a huge number of people. I would hazard a guess that that's an undercount of the people with disabilities. And when I say disabilities, that includes everything from people with physical disabilities, medical issues that rise to the level of disability, people who have hepatitis C, diabetes, people who have mobility issues, people who use wheelchairs, people who use walkers, people who have hearing, who are deaf or hard of hearing, auditory disabilities, low vision. I mean, it's a serious mental illness, learning disabilities. It's a huge range, right? So if you think about these amazing, it hurts my heart to hear about these amazing programs, right? That this education programs or the college courses that are, in fact, if you're looking to reduce recidivism, education is, in fact, the biggest, most proven thing that reduces recidivism. But to get to those programs, if you have a disability, is incredibly difficult for so many reasons. And we, at my agency, take calls from people in the prisons all day long. We take collect calls from all 12 prisons in the state. We take letters from people with disabilities in the state. And the things that we hear about in terms of people trying to access that system range from the seemingly small to seemingly insurmountable. So, for instance, if someone uses a wheelchair and the GED program is in another building, getting to that building can be hard. You need someone to push your chair to the other building, maybe. You might need to get a special permission for that person to come and get you. Maybe that person also has programming. Maybe you have a medical condition that makes it so you have to go to insulin line at a particular time of day. So getting to your course in time is impossible. Maybe you can't read or write. So doing your GED class, first you need to learn to read or write. Maybe you need an accommodation that would allow you to participate in that class if you can't read or write, so someone who takes notes for you, or to get the materials orally, to be able to do tapes as your assignments. These are all things that are that we get calls about. And the prisons generally are not designed to be individualized, right? This is it's an economy of scale. You're serving a lot of people, and now you have people who need very specific, often very individualized accommodations. So just getting a walker can be a years-long headache. A walker that will let you get to your class. Or more time for movement. You have 10 minutes to get somewhere. Can you get there in that amount of time if you're using a cane? Maybe not. So there is just this immense range, and then to add to that in terms of if you need those things, to get them, you have to ask for it in writing in most places. So in Washington, you send a written request. You contact your counselor in writing. You send medical something in writing. So all of these things, you also have to sort of navigate that system, again, with a disability. If you're in segregation, everything I just said is compounded. So you are locked down and you're doing a GED class in your cell, and you have a disability. So when I think about how amazing these programs are and how, the job programs and the education programs that people can access and the massive impact that that can have on you, thinking about how we can make those programs accessible to people with disabilities and how we can make the process for navigating the prison system, that alone, something that people with disabilities can do, is something that is sort of what our work focuses on.
Thank you for that. And I now want to turn to Bianca Tylick, who focuses on, so she focuses with her work on the profit that is a part of corrections. And, we talked a little bit about, you mentioned one of the companies that provides tablets. And, I know that Bianca has looked at a lot of those companies that, do provide tablets to correctional departments as well. And we've heard from, these panelists about rehabilitation programs, and, your work does focus on the commercialization of corrections and the justice sector. What role does the private sector play in rehabilitation? According to your research, how does it impede the possibility of rehabilitation? And in some of our, previous conversations, we've discussed, this idea that rehabilitation cannot be achieved in a vacuum, and that this broader commercialization of corrections and prisons affects reentry more than rehabilitation efforts. Can you explain, some of your research on these questions?
Sure, thank you. This mic is questionable. Thanks, Albie. So I think, just sort of starting with the question posed by the panel, do prisons rehabilitate? I'll just start by answering that question and say no. I think there's been amazing programs that have been mentioned up here, most of them ironically all served by nonprofit organizations, not by for-profit organizations. And we have to sort of understand the same way we talk about education, right? Specifically about the way that context matters, right? If a child is going to school from 7 to 3, that's not enough to ensure that they're going to be successful in life. We also have to think about the context within prisons, right? And what's happening outside of the few hours that somebody is in a program every single day, right? What is the environment that they are in? And knowing that, even focusing on rehabilitation itself tends to focus on the individual and put all of the blame and all of the attention and all of the focus there rather than on the systemic issues and the situational factors that drove them into facilities in the first place, into prisons, into crime, and into that type of behavior and lifestyle. It's also worth noting that in prisons, security comes first. Like, no ifs, ands, or buts. Like all these programs, great. First primary budget item at a prison is security, is staff, is like all of the things that are not part of rehabilitation, that are part of first fastening, securing, shackling, moving bodies, right? And understanding sort of that paradigm where what's like rehabilitation is one of the last things to be funded and it's the first thing to be cut when budget cuts come around, right? And as I noted, it's the reason that most of this is actually provided by nonprofit organizations and not even by the facilities themselves, let alone by a private contractor. And that's largely because prisons aren't actually intended to be rehabilitation centers, right? Like we always get into this debate about what is prison really about, what is incarceration really about? Is it about rehabilitation, or have we proven time and time again that it's about punishment and incapacitation, right? And that neither of those two things are rehabilitation in any driven way. So with most programs being provided by nonprofits, why is that? It's because there's no money in programs. If it is the first thing, if the last thing to be funded and the first thing to be cut, why would any for-profit industry or company get into that business? Knowing that there's not, an ample sort of amount of funding available for that particular thing. It would just frankly be a really bad decision. And so when I hear about private companies that are coming in with tablets and other things, my first question is, what are they actually attaching their bottom line to? And it's not the programs, right? The tablets that are being provided within facilities that are outfitted and sold to states and local agencies as these, rehabilitative devices or things that include educational materials tend to include far worse materials than would otherwise be available in other spaces that is not for-profit driven, that are provided by the nonprofit agencies and places like BARD that do amazing work. And more than that, they're actually really just tied to their profit driver. So for example, with tablets, the companies that bring these tablets in, the way that they bid on a contract is not as a rehabilitation programming company. They bid on telecom contracts that happen to have a few materials on them, right? Or some other tools that we can use that come free of charge to the state. But along with that, and I mean in New York State, we can talk about what's recently happened with JPay coming in. JPay is a major provider here in New York State of now tablets. They're bringing in 52,000 tablets free to the state so that the taxpayer doesn't have to pay, in case we're all worried about that. And what are they going to do? They're going to charge the population for everything that they do on that tablet, except for the few educational materials that are on it, right? And so you have JPay charging $4.15 to deposit $10 in New York State. Yeah, ask that question again. What? Right? To use that service and to do some of those things, that's exactly what they do, right? And so sure, they bring in some of these other tools, but they create an environment that is not about rehabilitation. They create an environment that is about money, right? Their parent company also has the contract for telephones in New York State, right? So just seeing sort of how embedded one of these companies can get, how they can convince of so many theoretically beneficial products, but also entrench themselves in a way where they do one thing that is also really deeply tied to rehabilitation, which is put space and keep widening that space between people who are incarcerated and their loved ones, right? So we all know that rehabilitation programs, education is really important to people and their ability to sort of re-enter successfully, but so are communication ties with your family, right? So is your ability to get housing. And when you layer on the cost of incarceration that hits families, all of those things end, right? When it costs families a tremendous amount of money to communicate via telephone or to drop money into somebody's account because the food isn't sufficient and they need to, have commissary or money to access commissary, then you are reversing and undermining whatever you think you're doing in rehabilitation in every which way. And those two things can't go hand in hand. So if we want to provide the rehabilitative programming, aside from the fact that we still have to talk about the systemic functions and what happens to people when they get home, we need to take the money out of the system, stop charging them for every last thing that happens, and allow them to have a world to go into that involves family and friends and support structures that stops debit release cards, which have recently also just been introduced, that cost $10 just to close the account on which you were given money on. Right? These are the same companies that we're now trusting to bring our educational materials into the facility.
I want to respond to that real quick. Sure. So there are a couple of different kinds of tablets, right? There's one that you're talking about with communications and all that. I'm really familiar with JPay, just never have used them for very similar reasons that you're talking about. One of the distinctions, though, is like the tablet that our students use. These are tablets that are purchased by the university with the Second Chance Pell Grant. So they don't have any of the bells and whistles on them, right? It's just a learning management system. So the students can't communicate with their families. That's not what they're intended for. They're actually intended only for the university courses. But yeah, I can get behind your argument there on the other. So,
Many states they are.
Oh yeah, and well, in most, because and particularly if it's purchased by the agency itself.
For the person.
Right. Yeah. So we don't use that in DC, and we didn't use it in Texas either when we used just the learning management system on the same tablet. The other thing I would say is that I would agree that education is not rehabilitation. So I'm a 30-plus year educator. So before I did this, I was a public school educator, and I don't think at any time I was in a high school that I would have said our high school was a rehabilitation center. So I wouldn't say that in a correctional facility either. But it's rational choice theory, right? If we give people better tools, better skills, better knowledge, would they make better choices? And what we hope is that the answer is yes. Is that rehabilitation? So I don't have a medical degree. I'm not a therapist. I don't pretend to be. So the question is, are prisons rehabilitative? That's a whole argument we can get into. But I don't think I would consider education to be rehabilitation. Just prep for hopefully making better choices. Does that make sense? A little distinction there.
And to both of your points, when we talk about JPay and video visitation, I think making the connection to this panel about are prisons rehabilitative, one of the dangers that I see with the access of more and more technology in prisons and more jails and departments of corrections specifically utilizing this technology is this trend towards more video visitation and elimination of in-person visitation. And we've seen some prisons, because of safety and security, and it is expensive to have officers check everyone for contraband and families coming in. And so a lot of prisons across the country have moved away from in-person visitation. And, as Bianca noted, it's very expensive. Video visitation could cost someone $10 for half an hour. So, is that rehabilitative when you can't touch, feel, hug your family members? Something we haven't discussed yet that I wanted to allude to, and I know we've had some conversations preparing for this panel. We talked about education, and is that rehabilitative? How do you prove something is or is not rehabilitative? What does that even mean? And one concrete way that we aim to do that is through tracking recidivism rates. Recidivism rates are different state by state. Are we talking 3-year recidivism, 5-year recidivism, state, national? Are we talking about rate of arrest, rate of criminal justice contact? What racial biases and disparities are related to over-policing in their urban cities? It is so hard to track recidivism rates, yet to receive, funding for programming, everyone wants to know, is it working, and sort of intuitive, education and some of these programs can't, they have to be better than the alternative, but how do you prove and how do you, show funders and show the government and show, whoever wants to fund these programs that it's working? So I'd love to hear from you, what are you doing to track recidivism rates, to track success of these educational opportunities?
Okay, it's a complicated question for a number of reasons, but first and foremost, you have to understand that when someone comes to state prison, we do an assessment of what all their potential needs are. And so if we find that you have a need, that you have a background of drug addiction, you might have a substance abuse treatment need. If you have not yet achieved a high school diploma, then you will need an educational program. You might need a vocational program. If there's violence in your background, a mandatory program would be aggression replacement treatment. So you could have multiple needs that we'll have to address while you're incarcerated. And then to try and pinpoint and say, okay, we know this program works, right? The substance abuse. Well, if you had a cohort where that was the only need, and then you had a comparison group where they had the same identical need, but they didn't get that program, then you compare recidivism rates and you say, okay, this is proven to be an effective program. You have a lot of different things that you have to look at. The bottom line is the baseline 3 years and out, and how many come to prison. And yes, it is a stubborn figure around 40%. The good news is that we happen to be one of the dramatic stories in criminal justice in this country because our population keeps going down. Right now in state prison, it's about 48,000 under 500, 48,484. In December of 1999, December 1st, there were 72,600 inmates in state prison in this country. So that has been a very steady decline, and it is still declining. And I would also add that a lot of programs that we provide, and I was able to get some of these laws changed, there's an incentive for successful participation. The strongest incentive from an inmate's perspective is to be able to earn an earlier release. And a big change is a law I got changed some years ago. It's called the limited credit time allowance. We know about the programs for the non-violent inmates. They can get out early, merit time, substance abuse, high school education, etc. But we had nothing for the longer-term, more serious inmates, starting from murder, manslaughter, all the homicide offenses. You got that sentence, truth in sentencing, you had to stay in prison for at least 85% of the term. We were able to get a comprehensive bill through. The incentive is if you complete one of 8 or 9, or I think it's up to 11 now, 12 boutique kind of programs, like get your master's degree from the Theological Seminary in Sing Sing, 2 years of college program, you become qualified in the DMV program, you pass certain examinations. They're not basic programs, they are somewhat elite, but they are significant. And the legislature went along with it so that the individuals who do that and are well behaved are able to get out 6 months earlier. That is a significant cut in time. And cumulatively, I can tell you that since we started the program, at least at the end of 2017, $14 million in prison avoidance costs were saved. So there's a lot to providing an incentive, because it also leads to safer prisons. You have to not just participate in the program, you have to maintain a positive record, and that helps with safer institutions. I agree that on a related issue, family relations are extremely important. They really are. And if somebody's been in prison a long time and they don't have a family to go to, the alternative is a homeless shelter. So we reinforce family ties wherever we can. The phone contract that you mentioned, that is by the parent company, it's called Securus. We just rebid it and rewarded it. The rate now is lower than it had been. It's one of the lowest in the countries. I think it's about 0.43. Okay, so that's the rate. So and there's a statute. We can't use any phone commission money at all for any type of other programs. At one time in our state, we did. We made a lot of money, and you're right. We shouldn't be making money off of inmates and their families. They don't have a lot of money to begin with. There's a lot of things that I do to try and soften the impact on them. For example, years ago, there was a statute that was passed that said we can charge $1 a week for every inmate. It's called the general incarceration fee, unless we decide it's a hardship. I decided it's a hardship for everybody. We're not going to do that. We don't need to make money off of families and their loved ones. We have a family reunion program. That costs money. And that could be under attack because people don't think that when you go to prison, you should be able to have an intimate relation with your entire family, whether it's your parents, your son, your daughter. We try and maintain some kind of normalcy. The visiting rooms, they're important. And yes, they're also a means by which contraband can come in, and sometimes dangerous contraband. But the higher value is maintaining family contacts. And we even tried a new initiative, which has been very successful. We call it Celebrate Your Children event. And we've done this at several facilities, which was Sing Sing, I think Wallkill. We have one coming up, Fishkill, where we take the entire evening and we said we're going to create an atmosphere so that the father, in this case, can bond with his young child. The caretaker is cared for off-site at a church, whatever. We have speakers for them, feed them, etc. But we make it like a Disney-like atmosphere solely for the parent, the father, to bond with the young child. Face painting, a magic act, music, pizza, whatever it is, pictures, so that they can have a special memory created bonding with their child. Forgetting that it's a correctional facility, for one night we try and recreate an atmosphere. And the memories and the feedback we've gotten have been very positive. So family contacts are important. There are companies that make money off these things. We try as best we can to minimize that in New York.
Thank you. I want to quickly let Bianca speak, and then we're going to start the Q&A session. I think we're late on that, so Bianca's going to
I'll be real quick.
quickly speak.
I'm really excited to hear that, Commissioner Annucci, that hopefully we can renegotiate some of these fees that JPay has and is instituting. I did want to just make a really quick comment on what folks are now starting to call video visitation, and just urge everyone to stop calling it video visitation. Video, when you FaceTime, your sister in California, or you use Skype, you don't ever call it a visit, right? That's not an actual thing. I've never been like, I'm visiting you in California on my phone. And this is a very intentional tactic. All of these things, the language that we use and that we have floating around has been language that's been created by the industry to suggest that it is the same as in-person visitation, and to actually remove those things, right? And so it is very important that we stay vigilant as people, in the same way that any marketing or advertising comes to you on your television, and know that the words we're using is intentional, and that we don't allow them to start replacing those things, because those are not really for contraband or for these other factors, they are in fact, in many states, and I'm not saying New York, but being used to replace in-person visits for something that is actually commissionable to that agency and does cost really, really high rates.
Thank you for that. And I'm sure we have some questions from the audience, so just raise your hands and we'll get you a microphone. Yes. Oh, and then next.
Hello? Okay, this works. First of all, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your thoughts on this very important topic. So I have a question for Bianca, but it's also more than open to anyone else who wants to pitch in. So just curious on the topic of kind of alternatives to rehabilitation and getting people out of jails. We want them to be proactive with their life, engaging with their families. So Bianca, on the topic of financing, let's say if you encourage earlier release by attending one of the boutiques that Anthony was mentioning. So if you encourage them to attend one of these boutiques so that they can leave jail 6 months earlier, a year earlier, that otherwise overhead cost that you would be spending on that person to be in that jail, would you say that you could use that funding and money for other rehabilitation programs?
That's what they call a lead question.
Sorry?
Leading question.
Oh.
Like
So-
as an attorney. Yeah.
So I don't know, those are just some thoughts I was thinking of because I work for an international development firm, but we help to think about rule of law and justice reform in other countries, and so financing is a really heavy dilemma. And so I was just trying to think about alternatives, overhead costs. Anyway, so before I go on a tangent, I just wanted to ask you that question. Thanks.
Yeah, I almost feel like I don't want to say too much because, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think, some when we do have people who are early released or folks that you're thinking that you've saved some, or even diversion programs, right, that exist, this idea of reinvesting in something else that would be another diversion program or programming generally is generally the way you want to spend that money, not investing it into anything from additional security to policing is not the way that would be a successful reinvestment of that money, but certainly thinking about it in that ways. And there are a few things out there that I'm not going to mention because they have a few problems, but are thinking about doing stuff like that, which is that as you save costs on diverting people from or releasing people early from correctional systems and prisons and saving the large amounts of money that frankly that cost, reinvesting them in programs is certainly one option.
I don't think anybody's going to disagree with that.
It is a good point, and I will say, first of all, our governor has closed 13 correctional facilities, so that's a very significant downsizing. And I think a formula going forward would be, if you're going to close more prisons and you want to, Ro's trying to save the state money, we never have enough. But using part of it to reinvest in things that are important, like programs that you describe, would certainly work. One thing I will say is that costs keep going up. I can't even begin to tell you what I spend on pharmaceuticals alone, the medications for the mentally ill that you described. The treatment for hepatitis C keeps going up. It's astronomical. Salaries go up. Benefits go up. So my budget, which is $3.257 billion, it's not like I'm funded for everything. Even, my overtime goes up when I have to do one-on-one suicide watches. That's very expensive. When I have significant staff out on workers' comp, I still have to cover those posts. So it sounds simple, okay, we're going to save money because X number of inmates are not going to be in the system. You'll have that much money. It gets sucked up very quickly by all these other things. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the best way to reduce costs in a state correctional and parole system is less inmates and less parolees. Everything else is just window dressing, but at the end of the day, that's the best way. When you can actually either close an entire correctional facility or close housing units, then you don't have to staff them and you can start to bring the costs down and hopefully fund the things that are necessary and appropriate.
I know we had a question here in the front row.
Thank you. My name is Ronald Simpson Bay. I'm with Just Leadership USA. And my question is for the Commissioner and the Deputy Director. It's commendable to hear that both you are high-level administrators and promoting programs in education. That is truly commendable. But I guess my question is, and you kind of spoke to the problem, is that you'll get not just a community, but you have staff people that conflate the issues and say, well, my child doesn't have college, so why should I make it easy for these guys to go to college? Exactly. That's my point. So how do you educate, or what do you do to influence your lower level staff to get on board with the programs and things that you guys are trying to push?
One thing is this, and I say that every correctional administrator in the country, if they were asked this question, who do you want to have as a model for the rest of the population to follow? The gang leader or the classroom leader? You want the gang leader. I have an issue with gangs. We have an issue with violence. We have an issue with drugs. When you have people involved in positive things like college programming, and they're really deep programs, and they're demanding, that goes against all of that, which means it's a much safer environment. People forget. When you have someone serving a sentence in prison, right alongside of them, every second, every minute, are staff. Staff there, not just security, all kinds of civilian. They have to have dentists to work on their teeth. They have to have nurses take their blood pressure, vocational instructors to try and teach them programs, teachers to teach, people to deliver the services, do the laundry. Every correctional facility is like an independent municipality. 24 hours a day, fully staffed. And so for staff safety purposes, that is something that has to be encouraged. Could there be creative ways that while you're doing this for the population, you also have a way to find and fund scholarships or whatever for children of individuals that work in the correctional facilities and can't afford college? Yeah, maybe that might take some of this thing out of it. But you set the message at the top and you really define it as it's better for everybody to have these kinds of programs. Much safer prison, safer outcomes. Your tax bill will be lowered ultimately if we're not spending as much on correctional facilities. You try and get as much buy-in that way. You're never going to overcome all of that. There are always going to be some objectives to that. But at the end of the day, especially when you take the time to show these stories, right? The inspirational individuals that really have their lives transformed. I just had Sean Pica was the speaker at Bear Hill. You know his story. He started out at Elmira. He was scared to death, committed a homicide at 17. Correction officer rapped on his cell and said, I could use your help. I can't do anything. Yes, you can. You're smart. You can help the other inmates that need help in reading, et cetera. And from there, he took off and he spoke to the population at Bear Hill. He said, I ended up at the White House. At 17, I committed a homicide. Recently, I was at the White House to meet the president. That's the potential, the journey that education can take you on. Very inspiring stories.
There's a question here in the front row, and then
Can I just answer this one really quick?
Yes.
So we've done some creative things. So I'm also in charge of staff education. So I'm over all training. So I train all the cadets, everybody, all staff for our agency. So I also create parity. We did a college fair for inmates, and then I had a college fair for staff. I found universities that would offer 30 hours of credit if an officer went through our basic training. So basically, they got a year of tuition free, right? So if I do something special like a master class for inmates, then I'll offer something really similar to staff. We have universities and different entities in the DMV area that offer certifications for correctional officers, for case managers, social workers, or whatever. If they want to teach that class, I offer them the space in the jail, and they come in, and our staff are given time to go do that. So it was really important to me when I came on, and I talked to our director and said, here's what I see. Every great thing I do for an inmate, a staff feels resentful about it, so let's don't start that way. So we really work on parity in that way.
thank you. And here in the front row.
Okay, according to the program, one of the topics to be discussed at this panel was solitary confinement. And I guess we just missed that, but let me ask a question. For many years in the state system, the disciplinary system was very arbitrary and draconian or whatever. And recently, I guess within the past 4 or 5 years, as a result of some litigation and consent decree with the NYCLU, there was a new disciplinary system put into place. I know the department is very big on statistics. You have a whole unit. Since that took effect, can you give us an overview of what the disciplinary and segregation system is these days as far as numbers and everything else?
Yes, I can tell you that it's still a work in progress, because when we entered into this comprehensive settlement agreement, similar to what we did for the seriously mentally ill, we decided in order to really do this right, you have to physically, dramatically change the units themselves. You have to add programs there. You have to have group recreation. And so the centerpiece hasn't even opened yet, and that's going to be the unit at Southport, where we're going to take entire block, 252 cells, and structure in such a way so that the individuals will be able to come out for 4 hours a day of programming, plus 1 hour of outside recreation.
Congregate.
And congregate rec as well. So we have that. We have a step-down unit right now at Greenhaven and at Wendy for the individuals who are now in SHU and are headed for the community to get them ready. All kinds of different courses that are being provided as well. We recognize that we were pretty draconian, and that goes back to the early 90s. And I'd say every correctional system in the country, if they knew then, 30 years ago, what we know now, we would have built these units very, very differently. There's no question that there is potential harm from long-term isolation and not human contact. By the same token, you have to protect the population. It's just as equally a constitutional right for failure to protect if somebody gets significantly cut and then that same individual is back to do it again a week later. So we're trying to balance a lot of different things. I can tell you that the numbers in SHU have come down significantly. In fact, start of this fiscal year, we closed, I forget the total number. It's, I think close to 1,000 SHU beds taken completely offline and or converted for one of these special programs. And we're still looking to do a lot more. Nobody wants to have somebody in SHU. We certainly don't want them in SHU where they might deteriorate, and we don't want them there for any longer than they have to be there. We want them to be successful, want them to be safe, want them in general population getting programming. So I can tell you that there has been a dramatic reduction in the number in SHU and the length of time they're serving, while we're also providing programs and amenities out of cell time, and we're internally discussing even things that we might be able to do further than what we've already required to do under the comprehensive settlement agreement with the NYCLU. So we're always looking to possibly do things better. Everything obviously costs. You have to make the physical changes. You have to have the staff to do the escorts out of cell, et cetera. But clearly, it is something that we're trying to really make a lot of progress toward.
Thank you. We have time for one more question over here.
The Vera Institute and others have taken teams of correctional leadership and correctional officers to Europe to look at facilities that are clearly rehabilitative in their design and layout, et cetera. So when I saw the title of this session, my first thought went to facility. How could your programming, which is terrific, because we fund, I'm with the Tao Foundation, we fund college and prison, we fund theater and prison, and I see you, Commissioner, there all the time. But when you have facilities like we have around this country, with cells, with just the whole culture in there, how can your programs be rehabilitative? And when I think about the facilities that have been closed in New York and in Connecticut, could one be retrofitted into some design that's like the European model, and let's test and research whether we get better outcomes by using facilities like that instead of the prison design we have in this country?
And building off that question, I was recently lucky enough to receive a grant from the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting to travel to Australia and New Zealand to visit prisons in those countries. And they, some of these prisons are very similar to some of the prisons in Norway and Germany, where the incarcerated people were cooking their own meals. They lived in basically dorm room-esque, suites with 4 people to a dorm. They do their own laundry. They have resumes when they apply for jobs within the prison. So there certainly are other models out there. These are very different countries with vastly smaller prison populations. But other countries are experimenting and innovating. So sort of building off of that, how far are we from those models?
We actually applied for a grant with the Vera Institute because of that research, and then they came back and we're doing some innovative things around youth, right, 18 to 25-year-olds in adult prisons. And we weren't a recipient of that grant, but we were lucky enough that the Vera Institute sort of partnered with us and sent us to Cheshire, Connecticut, and we looked at a unit there that they had modeled after what you're talking about, and then we modeled our own. So we have a unit called the Young Men Emerging Unit, or YME unit, that's really similar to that. So they have a salary, right, and they pay for their room and board, just so we try to make it as realistic as possible. But the unit itself is they have their own laundry, they cook their meals, they have, try to make it as much like that model as we can, in a jail that was built whenever it was built. So other than building from the ground up, trying to retrofit these places to do that is difficult, but not impossible. So we've seen, I see Mark in the audience that he's visited that unit. It's been really remarkable, the difference in that. And so from that, when we saw that, then we started looking at unit programming, right, and looking at our other units and saying, okay, how can we create that same environment there? So we're in the process of trying to talk about a new jail, and that's one of the things we did last week, is just looked at these models, right, that other places are now trying to use based on that research. So yeah, isn't that crazy, the difference, right, and their outcomes as well. So
Yeah, I wanted to add a few different thoughts that may not all be connected. But in New York, as we're talking about closed Rikers, and it's great to have people here from Just Leadership, right, who are working on those initiatives. We know that we can't close Rikers without substantially reducing the population. And that's something that obviously LB just noted, which is that in order to get to the type of facilities that are being mentioned, we have to have a lot less people who are incarcerated, right? In order to have that space, find space in New York, right? This is actually a very concerted conversation right now about what these new jails are going to look like in New York, and we have serious questions about or concerns, I should say, around just the concept of building new facilities, right? And understanding that will the old facility actually be shut down, because there's been places where that's been suggested and not happened, and it's just created more capacity and more beds. And so thinking about what that next vision looks like, understanding that we have to wildly reduce the population, and think about, one of the conversations we were having with the group recently is there's some jail in Oklahoma that I think it's Tulsa County Jail, but that has a phone in every cell, right? Just thinking about access to things like that as we're talking about access to communities and all of that, and whether that's even a realistic conversation we could have with places. But I think the other thing that we do have to understand, while we should never exceptionalize ourselves in the USA around why we're different and therefore can't do things like other places, because there's a tremendous amount to learn. But one of the things we do have to do in that process, it's real for us to have facilities that look like that, is take the money out of the system, which doesn't exist in majority of other places, right, in the world. When we think about bail and just the notion that we have 500,000 people roughly every night who are sitting in prison pre-trial, because they can't, for the most part, afford bail, and know that we are one of 2 countries in the world that have a for-profit bail bonds industry. Those things should give us pause and should be something we need to rectify, is not just our prison system and how we do that, but how entrenched it is in our capitalistic structure and our idolatry of capitalism.
And I believe we are out of time. I'm glad that we could end on a somewhat hopeful note, and really want to thank all of our panelists today who are, spending all of their waking hours really trying to make the justice system better, whether it's through working to improve programming behind bars, providing better, safer environments for people with disabilities, and really thinking thoughtfully about the profit that is in corrections. And it's 2018. Maybe in 10 years we'll reconvene and see what we think about rehabilitation when it comes to prisons, and whether we have been able to create any of these model jails and prisons in the U.S. So thank you again for spending your afternoon with us.